let folks come in. Can everybody hear me? Rather than my phone. Well, good evening, campers. How are you? You think I'm kidding? The Middletown First Aid Squad is going to roll in cots tonight because by the time you get outside, it'll be a blizzard.
It's snowing right now.
You'll be able to go home.
I got a great driver.
So, by all means, be careful. So, I'm going to introduce myself. First, let me introduce Laura, who's kind of hosting us here tonight at the Middletown Library. And some other, you guys know that you have a great library system, right? And also, we have a lot of folks here, many of you I know, that I will introduce in a second. But we're going to, I'm Rick Geffken, if you haven't figured that out. Peter just walked in, good. And we're going to talk about this tonight. And in spite of the title, it happened in Middletown. Okay, because at that point in time, Navesink Highlands was part of Middletown proper. So before I begin that, let me ask Tom Valenti, who's president of your Middletown Historic Society. You want to make an announcement about something, Tom?
Sure. Thanks, Rick, for letting me a little plug. So this is not one of our events, but we do hold events that are similar to this throughout the year. So if you're interested in speakers like Rick, you can go to our website, middletownnjhistory.org, and see the list of speakers that we have coming up for this year. We have hold events just like this, totally free to come to. And something else interesting we're doing is that we are working on transforming the old Middletown railroad station into a museum. So you have the current railroad station. We are across the street in the smaller daily commuter lot. It's an old building there from 1875. And we're working on fixing it up a little bit, trying to get some grants, trying to find people who want to help. And come 2026, we're going to be opening it up with our first exhibit about the revolution in Middletown. So everybody look forward to that. You can sign up for our emails or follow us on social media. That's middletownnjhistory.org. Thanks.
And if you're old like me, you remember when that train station was a little red building. We also have some other distinguished guests. We've got Peter Van Nordwick, who's one of our county historical commissioners. Give him a wave. Sitting next to him is Ray Beth, who, if you know the Beth family name in Middletown, then you'll know who Ray is. And if you don't know that Beth family name, you haven't been to Middletown a long time. Okay, and Ray and I have done a lot of things. We've got the Daughters of the American Revolution represented here. So, and then I'm sure the rest of you have a lot of interest in history as well. Okay, so let's talk about this. The Battle of Navesink, so-called, right? As I mentioned, it actually began 248 years ago, Thursday, when this all happened. So tonight, 248 years ago, a British fleet was leaving from Staten Island to come down here and engage in this. So it's quite historic. And as I mentioned too, at that point, the events we're going to talk about were actually happening in Middletown. So how many folks know about this battle?
I've heard about it.
Yeah, and you know what, like me, I heard about it too until several years ago, and I had no idea until I did some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about tonight, how that works. So let's see if I can work this in my phone. Yes, good. Okay, thank you. So I had heard about it, and one of the kind of insights into it was this article that appeared in the New York Times in 1896. About the Battle of Navesink. The headline is always on the first slide before I got that. And it's pretty detailed, and it was written by somebody named M.C. etc., etc. Okay, you can see in a second. And I thought, wow, there's a lot of information here. And I recognize a lot of these places because I lived in Middletown for 10 years, okay, and I grew up in the Highlands during the summer. So a lot of the places were very familiar to me. And that was intriguing at the start. M.C. Murray Hyde also wrote, after this article, a couple months later, in what was then a very prominent historical magazine, a kind of fleshed out version of this story. So it was really interesting. I said, wow, this is great. How did this person know all of that? And by the way, who was this person? Okay, and I said, well, it's got to be some guy writing for the New York Times at the turn of the 2 centuries ago. And the story basically is that here, you'll recognize Sandy Hook, I hope, okay? Here, I don't know how this slide works, let's see. Okay, there it is, okay, so there's Sandy Hook, we're over here, see Middletown, that would be about where Kings Highway is, so right where we are almost. And all of this area here, we all know it very well. And she talks about here, this shipwreck and the events that led to this incredible thing. So in the article, there's this talk about Long Point in Highlands, and I had never heard that name, and that was kind of intriguing. So because I don't have anything else to do in my life, I went up to the New York Library one day to look into this person's files that had been all stored and archived in the New York Public Library. And sure enough, I found the original sketch that the New York Times, whoever that artist was, took that from. And it's in a place that you know, right? Hartshorn's Cove, and you can see the similarity. But right here, maybe if I can do this right, there's a house picture. And that is the original location, not the one today, of what was called Portland House, Portland Point. You know that big house now there, off Hartshorn's Drive down that way? Okay, that's on the other side of this cove. So I'm just giving you some ideas of how
What's the vantage point on that? Where are we looking from?
the river from on the Rumson side. You're looking north. I'm going to show you some more. That's a good question.
So on the right would be like
Correct. Seabright and Monmouth Beach and all that.
I mean,
And by the way, thank you for doing that. I would like you all to do what he just did. Interrupt about anything. About, you have a comment or something you know, or a question. No, I'm sincere. I don't want to just add along. And so here it is, right? And one of the many maps that we're going to look at tonight. And so you can see here most of Sandy Hook. Here is what we call, what I hope you call Hartshorn's Woods. We're going to talk about that. Here's Rumson. So here is that area pictured here. And so when I started to look at this, I said, oh, wait a minute. Look at that. Portland Place, the house that the Monmouth County Historic, I should say the park system runs today, which is this beautiful place there. But that's on the far west side of this cove. The original house, Portland House, that Richard Hartshorn lived in, was on the other side. It's no longer there. So I was trying to put all these things together. And then, of course, I figured out where Long Point was. And if you're from Rumson or that area of the Navesink River, Long Point is here. So that drawing's wrong. And that's not because of MC Murray Hyde. That's because whoever did the picture and wrote this up in the New York Times described it wrong. Because I had never heard of the Long Point over there. It's a peninsula that you might know today, and you'll see that in a second as well. Because it's Barley Point. Okay? And you can see Hartshorn's Cove over there. You can see Sandy Hook Way in the back. This light doesn't work here as well. Maybe you can turn that a little. Yes?
Hey, just a point while you have that slide up. The first yacht club in the United States was right in that cove called the Neptune Club.
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
Okay, and if you go there today, which I have done in my little kayak, you can see some of the foundations left over from the Neptune Club. And that's a whole other story. We should do a presentation just on that. So here's all the good news, and I hope you know this. Because of the history that we have in Monmouth County, but particularly Middletown, this peninsula, and also the one south of us, the Rumson and Fairhaven Peninsula, is just loaded with history since Europeans got here. That's not to mention the history of several millennia before that when the Lenape folks were here. Okay, and so we're fortunate to have all of this, some of which we'll talk about tonight. Okay, so who was MC Murray Hyde, I said to myself. And I don't know if you're going to be surprised, but I was. Because MC Murray Hyde wasn't a guy. Okay, and she also had a lot of historical presence, as does her entire family. You might recognize some of these names, right? It was Mary Crawford Murray, and she married a Dr. Ovid Hyde. So if you know anything about Middletown, then you can't avoid knowing Crawfords and Murrays. And in fact, that's what gave her all the credence to do these articles, because she had researched it for a long time. She was the great-great-granddaughter of James W. Cooper. You'll say, well, who's Cooper? Well, you'll find this out in a second, because he was one of the guys that was captured. He was a Monmouth County militiaman who was captured during this battle we're going to describe tonight. So she obviously knew some things. She was also the great-granddaughter of, as you can see, Joseph Murray. That name should strike a familiar note, because he was killed up the road a piece at the Murray farmhouse by loyalists a couple of years later. So she drew, even before she was married, as a young woman, on all this rich heritage in her family. There's a very famous historian named Beekman. You know the Beekman family? Okay. Well, she was cousins with them, and they had this lively exchange, which I have records of. It was kind of interesting. To speak about, if you go up the road to Parsley Park, okay, just to give you some background, Joseph Murray was home one day. He was a militiaman. He was home plowing his fields, as militiamen did, or maybe harvesting, I forget which. June, he would have been, I guess, plowing. And that was his original house. And in his cornfields, allegedly, 3 loyalists, people who were on the British side, civilians or possibly, refugees from Sandy Hook, had ambushed him and killed him when he had left his musket on the fence while he was doing his field work. And that's the house today. How many have been to Parsley Park? Okay, it's well worthwhile and really interesting history right here. So again, just in this little area of where we are in Middletown, there's an awful lot of Revolutionary War history. But my point here was not so much about them as to give her credibility. She knew a lot about what had happened here. So we'll get back to this map. And what happened on February 1377? So it turns out that, and I have to say this, that in Hartshorn's Woods, which I grew up saying Hartshorn. How many say Hartshorn? Right. And I think everybody pretty much does. But originally the family's name was Hartshorn. You know what a hart is? It's a deer. And I went to their hometown in Hathorn, England a couple of years ago to investigate the family. And over there they say Hartshorn. It's the antlers of a deer. But by the time I was growing up in Highland, certainly everybody calls it Hartshorn. So that was that. Anyway, what happened that night was that this guy named Evangelist Scudder, okay, was a Monmouth Militia colonel. He's down at a place called Black Point, which is here at the tip of the Rumson Fairhaven Peninsula. It's still called Black Point by a lot of people. And he found out that right there was a British victualizing, a supply ship, okay, that had come up on the beach. And so the Monmouth Militia, as everybody did during the Revolutionary War, went down to loot what they could off this, to get the food supplies and anything else they could off this ship in a couple of weeks before this event. Now, this is obviously a modern picture. Militiamen were, guess what, just like Joseph Murray. They were mostly farmers and whoever else. And they got conscripted or they volunteered when the Revolutionary War broke out to fight against both the loyalists, other civilians, who took the other side, and the British. And early in the war, there was more British activity here, meaning British troops, than later on in the war. So they went down and they apparently found out that this ship had been a captive ship, had a French captain. They let him go. The militia wasn't interested in him. And they start looting the ship. And then the word gets to the British a couple days later, because everybody in Monmouth County is spying on everybody else for the revolution. All right, so typically your neighbors, who are your best friends, maybe even your relatives, might have been on the loyalist side. They decided they want to continue to have their allegiance with Great Britain, and you decided that you want to be part of this new revolutionary rebel movement to establish a new country. Okay, so everybody is looking out for everybody else and spying, and so the word gets to the British, hey, they're looting this ship. And so what do the British do? They send down what they call new levies. New levies are people who basically got drafted, okay, from Staten Island, and they come down, and you'll see we'll get into the details, into this area, and they take control of that shipwreck, which is about where Monmouth Beach is today, okay? And along with them, on this ship that comes out, the British 26th Regiment of Foot. Doesn't that sound impressive? Okay. It's a Scottish regiment, actually. They, and this is all from Mary Crawford's article, she says they assault the militia at Quartermaster Richard Hartshorn's house. I said, that's interesting. Let's look into that. And that's an actual drawing of what the 26th Regiment of Foot looked like. And so keep that in mind when we get into what they actually did, because it was probably a night not unlike tonight. There had been this vicious snowstorm a couple of nights before this incident, and what they had to go through in those outfits was something else. And the net of it is, they surprised the militia, 25 of the Monmouth militiamen get killed, 40 escape, and 72 are taken as prisoners of war. So it's a complete disaster for the Monmouth militia. It's early in the war, it's 1777, but it's really not a good thing, obviously, for what you and I think of as patriots today. The British lost one guy. So just give you an idea of how unbalanced it is. And so I had, a lot of you know Randy Gabriel, he and I had a discussion, and I agree, it's not a battle, it's a skirmish at best, and it's a rout, okay? Because basically the Monmouth militia gave up. They were completely surprised, and there was no way that this was much of a battle at all. So we're going to talk about some more detail and where it happened, actually, because that's how I got started on this. So I looked at this map and I thought, wait a minute, there's something in her reporting that doesn't make sense to me. That arrow points to where Richard Hartshorn's house was, down to where the ship was. And she alleges in one of her articles that they spotted it. And I said, no, I don't think you could. Okay, it's not really in the line of sight. And here's a picture I took, mashed a couple together, actually from Hartshorn's Cove. And you see that if you try to look, and the house that the militia, Richard Hartshorn's house, was about on this side, there's no way you can see, that Barley Point today, and then you have Rumson. There's no way you can see a shipwreck on Monmouth Beach. So that got my wheels spinning about something a little bit off here. And we'll see if I can show you what that is. So you're going to get used to, I hope, a lot of maps. Here's obviously a more modern map of Sandy Hook, but probably 100 years old in and of itself. So one of the things she says, and this is not to take away from her, because she was a very good historian and researcher, but she says that the Tories, they retook that shipwreck on the Monmouth Beach coast there from Captain Roger Morris, and then she asserts that this is, that must be related to a guy named Lewis Morris, who lived at Blackthorn, basically, Passage Point. Okay? That Lewis Morris, by the way, was killed by two of his slaves in 1695 because he had abused one of their slave women, and they killed him. And then they were brought up to King's Highway and burned at the stake. Slavery is a whole nother smoke that we have to consider. But in any event, when I looked into that, again, I saw that there's no way they could see that shipwreck from where she alleges the militia had been. And it turns out, and again, this is a nit, but it got me thinking about a few things. Roger Morris, who was captain of that group of Tories who retook the shipwreck, was actually from a different part of England than Lewis Morris, who was from Wales. And again, just a nit, but she had a little of that more. And then here's the thing that really got me going. She said that militia had assembled at Quartermaster Richard Hartshorn's house. That's her spelling, okay? And he lived there. And that was another problem. Why would the militia station themselves there? Because you can't see anything. Okay? You're out of sight of all the kinds of activity that might have happened in Sandy Hook Bay, even off the coast, certainly that shipwreck. So that, again, got me thinking. Part of the story that she talks about is this guy, Major Gordon of the British, the 26th Regiment of Foot, had 170 troops, and she says he entered the mouth of the Navesink River, landed near Island Beach at the location of the Twin Beacons. She meant Twin Lights as we know it now. She's writing in 1896. Obviously, they weren't there when this incident happened. So, there's Island Beach, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. how does that make any sense, right? You can still see Island Beach today, it's now attached to Sandy Hook. And so I thought, well, let's see, how did this happen? Well, if the British came down from Staten Island on this route, and you should know, by the way, that there were a series of inlets up and down the coast. Every time we had a storm, maybe even tonight, that's about where she calls them the Twin Beacons, Twin Lakes they are. And then she said, in another one, in that second article, the British landed and proceeded about a mile further to the house of what, now she's hedging her bet. She doesn't say, and I think it's what we all do as researchers. We change our opinions all the time to get the information. She said, the house of one Hartshorn. But I said, well, wait a minute, which Hartshorn is it that she's talking about here? Turns out there were two living at that time, okay? I'm going to give you the family genealogy in a minute. Richard Hartshorn, in fact, did live in that first arrow on the south, but on the other side of what I think of as this hill, this mountain on Hartshorn Woods, his brother Isaac was living. And that made a little bit more sense to me about something which we'll talk about. She also says the British landed about 2 miles below the rebel post, wading up to their waist on the beach in Highlands. About 1 mile west near Richard Hartshorn. So none of this is making any sense, okay, because you and I know that Highlands is on that side, so they're not landing here and waiting on Highlands Beach, of course. So I go, oh wait, did they come down that way? Did they come down the inside way? You know, which is which? Okay, yet another map. So on the top, that red dot there, that's Isaac Hartshorn's house, which overlooks Island Beach and all of Sandy Hook Bay. And there's Richard's house, okay? And you can see here, see these inlets? Okay, as I was mentioning. Okay, she says, all right, she doesn't say this. General William Howe gave me the biggest hint. Not him in person, but I remember. A considerable number of rebels, meaning the Patriots, have appeared on the heights above the lighthouse at Sandy Hook. It can't be there. You cannot, from that side of Hartshorn Woods, see anything north of you. It's impossible. All you're going to see is woods and a hill. You don't know that. So that must mean, and I just superimposed that little image of the lighthouse when it was first built. Okay, that had to mean that what she was talking about and where the battle happened had to be here on this side. And that would make a lot more sense. Because if you're here in the hills of Highlands, you have a commanding view of any ships in the Sandy Hook Bay. You can see, and you've all done this, right? Like you can see all activity out here. And the fleet, the British fleet, would always come in here, anchor before they go up to New York. And so if you're in 1777 in the militia, you want to see the militia the British activity in Sandy Hook Bay to get an idea what's happening. And so, for instance, in 1776, the year before, George Taylor from Middletown saw 130 British ships there that were on their way to New York. And he looked at that. He was a Monmouth militiaman, and in 1776 he said, "I'm on the wrong side." And he literally bolted and became in charge. The British put him in charge of Sandy Hook for the rest of the war. Okay, so again, all of these factors are happening here in Middletown. Okay, she also says, this is kind of interesting, you recognize this too, that the British, when they got in to this part of the world, were piloted by this McLeese, who knew all the shoals and channels. And so I looked that up, and that's a guy named Cornelius McLeese. Does anybody recognize the McLeese name? McLeese Creek, which in my little kayak this summer, I went to visit and went way back up there. So you all know that if you go down Navesink River Road, McLeese Creek, because he owned all of this family owned all that property right there. And that made perfect sense to me, because if he lives here, of course he's going to know all these shoals and all the channels and all to that side of the river. And so it turned out that even though he was friends with a lot of rebels and patriots, he kind of helped the British. And that's not uncommon in the Revolutionary War. People switch sides all the time. Just talking about George Taylor, that's a military turncoat. But all kinds of people were interested in one thing. Can you guess what that is? Thank you, survival. Okay, and like all of us, if we're civilians, and we see this on the news anywhere in the world tonight, if you're a civilian and somebody takes over your town, yes sir, sure, I'll help you out anywhere I can, and then they leave and somebody else comes in, and you're again working to survive. You're trying to keep your family intact. You're trying to sell whichever side you can arrange to buy your crops, etc., etc. So that's going on here. McLean's apparently is one of these people. Okay, what happens next? So I thought, wait a minute, how does this work? And the only thing I could figure out was the British had to come along the outside, because if, as my supposition was, that the rebels were here, not here, if they were here, any activity of the British coming in here, they'd see right away. And it didn't make sense. They got surprised and overwhelmed. So if the British pulled in here, landed at Highland Beach, these guys here up the hill in Highlands are going to go, well, here they are, and here they come. And they'll do whatever they deem appropriate at that point. So the only thing that makes sense to me is that they must have come, the British must have come down here, they dropped off those new levies to secure the shipwreck, then they went in with the help of McLeese to what was then an inlet, landed at Rocky Point, you know that, right, today, and must have walked up to the other side of Hartshorn's Woods. And I'll show you some more things to kind of verify that. So I was out on those little sedge islands a couple years ago, and there's Rocky Point in the distance, see right in the way back, okay? And in fact, it makes a lot of sense that they would need, because the British, and of course these have changed over the years, the British wouldn't know the shallow parts of that river. They would use somebody like McLeese to help them, and then the easiest way to surprise the militia would be to land at Rocky Point and come up the other side, from the south side of Hartshorn's Woods to the other side. Because of this, the reports say that the militia, where they're guarding, the post was about 200 yards from the house, and they were first alarmed. So that means the guard, whoever or how many of them there were, who knows, couldn't have seen them coming until they got really close. And they fired a few shots, and pretty soon they get overwhelmed. A couple of these guards run back to the main militia house, and by then it's too late. The British come up and they create havoc all over the place. So to me, that absolutely put the kibosh on having the British come in that way. Okay, yet another map, and this is about the Hartshorns. So here, and you can't see it quite, this is Sandy Hook up here. It's very old. This is a survey map, I think, from 1754. And the map and the survey was commissioned because the two Hartshorn brothers were going to split that land. And that's what they did. So Robert Hartshorn gets this southern part, outlined in green, and his brother Asa gets this part. They both get the same acreage. It's a huge piece of property that we're lucky that it's still preserved today, right? By and large, most of it. And down here again is Hartshorn's Cove, and here you can see in this map the inlet that would lead into what we now know as the Navesink River. And the reason they did that was because their father had just died. And so he gave in his will his sons the property. Men always get the property, women don't in those days, okay? They had sisters, but that's not what happened. And so they split the property under who knows what circumstances. And they happen to be the grandsons of this guy. And that's the man whose property I went to see in England. That's Richard Hartshorn. He's the first Hartshorn to come here. He actually settled up in what is now basically the Keensburg area originally. And then he came down because he owned all this property, he had bought lots of different land grants. He wound up building his house, the original house in Portland. Okay. He called his original property in the Keensburg area Portland, and he kept that name when he came down. But he's the guy who came over here as quite a young man, bought property. He had to, by law in those days, from the Lenape Indians. He had all of Sandy Hook and all of what you and I call Hartshorn's Woods. And he lived on Kings Highway, too. He had lots of properties. So that's that, at least that family. And there's their family crest, and look at what's there. Hearts, deer, okay? And those of you who didn't study Latin, and I didn't, I couldn't remember any of it, Count Press means quite ready. Okay, so that's their family crest, the Hartshorns. So that's a little background on them. Now, luckily enough, unbelievably enough, we have a map and a chart here, and the depiction that was done in 1777 of exactly what we're talking about here. And the reason these were, besides charts, nautical charts, the British were unbelievable. All over the world, wherever they were calling, they would have an artist on board who would sketch what it looked like when they were entering harbors. And so their captains over time would have this accumulation of charts and maps and also these views of land. And you'll recognize it, right, if you've ever been in this part of our geography. Okay, there's the Sandy Hook Lighthouse, which was then built at the tip of Sandy Hook. It's now a couple of miles. As the literal drift of sand has filled in because the drift comes south to north. There's the woods in Sandy Hook. Here are just some chips probably for illustration. And there's the Highlands. So again, concurrent to this battle, and I'm sure this map was done probably in 1770s, but it was drawn in 1776, but the British certainly had it during this period. And when I blew that up, and this could be my hopeful imagination, I think I see a house there. And if I'm right, and even if I'm not right, that's where Esek Hartshorn's house was. And I'm going to show you a lot about that. And that makes perfect sense, because from that point you have this commanding view of everything that you want to see when you're looking out to understand what the British are trying to do. And why is that important? Because if you see the British fleet coming in, anybody ever hear the name Chapel Hill? You could set up a signal fire, and there were a bunch of signal fires to let the people in New York and Staten Island and everywhere else know what was going on. Not like horses going back and forth with messages, horse carriages, but signal fires and all kinds of other things. So that started to make sense to me. Are you tired of maps yet? Yeah, I'm never tired of maps. So interestingly enough, this one shows a lot of things. And first of all, it's done later because of a couple of things. The year after this battle, in a winter storm, that waterway broke, the Atlantic Ocean broke through, they call that the gut. Okay, it was in inland, basically. But this was all connected during the 1777 battle. But it does show, that would be Highlands and Navesink, that would be Rumsden and Fairhaven. It does show the other inlets down south of there. So that said to me, oh, that's how the British came in. They came in through one of those other inlets and then went north. And when I was at the Monmouth County Historic Association of Freehold, going through the Hartshorn papers, these people, by the way, never threw out anything. There were receipts for the smallest item they ever bought. It is this fantastic archive, and I went through some of the files, and I found that there were, it's hard to read, a couple of reports of the ocean breaking through, so it was not uncommon, including one written by Robert Hartshorn. So in this year of 1756, he reports that there was another inlet. And we see these all the time. So this was a common occurrence up and down our coast until they blockaded everything. Okay, yet again. So what happened was when the British get word that these militiamen are gathering and looting the supply ship and they're stationed above watching over Sandy Hook Bay, they send down a fleet from what was called Corliss Ferry up in Staten Island I shouldn't say a fleet. They send down the new levies, these Tory draftees basically, on this big 28-gun ship, and they come down, as you know now, and who's leading them but this guy, Major Gordon, who ironically after the war becomes the governor of the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. I figured that was interesting. There's a picture of Captain Robert Morris. He's the guy that takes charge of that shipwreck that started this whole incident. And sure enough, they come down this way, and then in another map of Hartshorn's Woods, here's what they did. Here's a rocky point here. That's the continuation of Sandy Hook there. And here would be, and it even says it, William Hartshorn, because William, Robert's father, was the guy that Robert and he said they wanted to split his property. And so that, you'll see in a second, is some of the confusion that happened in the report. Okay. There was this big snowstorm a couple nights before they got here, and so all the reports that I've read, not only Mary Hyatt's, but talk about how they had to go in those uniforms I showed you through the woods to surprise the militia. And so what they do is they land at Rocky Point, and they're going to walk up this way. And if you take a boat or if you drive down there, you know how thick those woods are. And, you know, they haven't changed a whole lot of the things, except they might have been thicker back then in 1777. And think about trudging, well, think about what you're going to do tomorrow morning. Okay? Trudging through ice and snow and, you know, freezing cold.
The British in the winter, did they fight in the winter? Or?
Yeah. Okay. That was the surprise element. He brings up a good point. Traditionally, in European battles and even in the early Revolution, they took off kind of in the winter. You know, they let each other kind of rest up. You know, Washington, for instance, is at Morristown one winter, is at Valley Forge another time. But the British took advantage this time of surprising them in the winter. So that's an excellent point. Thank you for that. That was, and here's where the confusion, I think, showed up. That was actually William's, or I should say, Robert's son, Richard Hartshorn, who was, in fact, the quartermaster for the Monmouth Militia. And that's where his house was. But if I follow what she had written, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense that if the British come here, how are they going to surprise people there? They have to come along the shoreline. You're going to hear them coming. The ship that dropped them off, you might not see the ship if it's at Rocky Point, but you're going to see them coming along. And that other quote that she said that they're coming up from a little bit south doesn't make sense either, because they then have to come across Clay Pit Creek, and they're making noise. So I quickly ruled out that that was where she meant for the British to have attacked the Monmouth Militia. And here's where Serena, you follow this, Serena? She asked me about this.
Yeah.
The reason there's so much confusion is there, like a lot of European descendant families, the names keep repeating and repeating and repeating. We still do that today to a certain extent, right? But they really did. So in that year, 1777, there's at least 3 Richard Hartshorns. One is the quartermaster. So he is, 33 years old, roughly. I can't find out when he died, not in this battle, but he's there. Robert's son is Richard, another Richard. And then, in Essex he's got a son, Richard, but he's too young. He can't be a quartermaster. He's 12 years old. So I think what happened in a lot of the research over the years, people mix these people up. And that's understandable. I do that all the time. When you look at Lewis Morris, I know that in Monmouth County there were at least 14 different Lewis Morrises, most of them related. So it's hard to keep track of this. So this is what I think really happened, and it's the only thing that makes sense. The British land at Rocky Point, okay? They trudge through the woods, and then the reports say they take 2 flanking lines to get to Easton Hartshorn's house. They surprise them because they're coming up. Remember, this is all hilly. They're coming up through the woods, and when they come up here, the guards see them, but it's too late. They're a couple hundred yards away, and the rout is on. And as I mentioned, the Monmouth Militia loses big time, right? 25 people killed, and then 72 were captured. Somewhere around 40 escaped, although some of them were wounded. They die in the woods. And I talked to a friend of mine who lives in Highlands up on those hills, and I said, you know what, there's probably Monmouth Militia people buried in these woods that have never been identified. As well as, I'll bet, it's tough to do now after 248 years, I'll bet there's all kinds of stuff that the British troops drop, because that's what people do, right? When you're marching, you're dropping stuff that's heavy, and you get rid of stuff you don't think you need, or you just drop stuff. So maybe some of that will be found. But in any event, so that got me thinking, oh man, I know some archaeologists. Wouldn't this be a great thing? Right? Rich Veit from Monmouth University, I talked to him about it, and I'll show you what came of that. Okay, and again, the British, because of the surprise element, and time of year, and all these things, just overwhelm the militia, and they only use one name. So, here's something that Ray Beth and I were talking about. A couple of months later, a guy named David Foreman, who the British called Black David, because he was notoriously violent and ruthless with the British. He was from Freehold. He puts together, and this is only one page, of the people who had been captured that night. And they were taken up to, you've probably heard this term, the old sugar house, right, which was up there in New York. Now, there are about 4 sugar houses, and there's some dispute as to whether they were all used for British prisoners or not. But at least these guys are taken to this old sugar house, and as the name suggests, these were where rich families, okay, would import sugar and sugar cane from typically Barbados and the Caribbean. They would process it, bag it, sell it from, New York was even then a very valuable port, in these sugar houses all over New York City. Okay, and so when the British take over New York in 1777, they convert all these to these horrible, putrid prison cells, of which some estimates are saying that probably 20,000 rebel patriots died in these things, because they put them in with whatever clothes they had on, they barely fed them, they treated them poorly. There was a prison ship in what was then Wallabout Bay, but basically where the Brooklyn Navy Yard is, called the Jersey of all places, where hundreds of men would die. And so the British were particularly brutal about putting this down. So all of these men and more wound up in that sugar house after they were captured at the Battle of Navesink. And there are some names there that you'll recognize. In fact, some of you might be related to some of those people. Anybody here a relative of any of those names? Okay, I just picked out some prominent names that you might know if you know anything about Monmouth County history, including, of course, Cooper, who was Mary Hyde's great-great, okay? And then these other names, Holmdel and Holmes, right, and all of those folks. Burroughs and Madawan, Smocks are all over Middletown and Holmdel. Obviously, you see some Dutch names, too, not just English names. So I just picked out some prominent names because of these people, some of them died in that prison camp, that sugar house, and some lived, okay, so got out. And we know a little bit about a lot of them. The DAR has done tremendous work with a lot of these folks and their names and their histories. And so, for instance, James Morris, not related to the other two, is on this list, and he's buried not too far from here in Navy Cemetery. And he lived after the war. So basically what I'm getting at here is that most of these folks, not just the ones I highlighted, but the rest of them, we have their names. The common person there was no photography, of course, they didn't have paintings of themselves, and so we don't have any images other than maybe their tombstones if they survived the war. Except for these two. The two that would make sense to me are officers, right? Joseph Stillwell, that's a very, very old Monmouth County name. There are Stillwell still all around. He's there. I think he's the guy that auditioned for the Coneheads. But maybe that's just me. And then, of course, David Foreman, Black David Foreman down here. But guess what? They're officers, which means they're landed, which means they're rich, which means they can afford to have people do sketches and paintings of them and these kinds of things. The yeoman farmer is not waiting to have his picture painted or doesn't have time to even think about that. So of that whole list of 77 people who were captured, we only have those 2 images, except for one more. Not Dorn from Red Bank's Dorn Town. This is a much later drawing of Betty Dorn, who was a black slave who was at Esek Hartshorn's house. She was enslaved by his family she's like 14 years old, during the battle. And it struck me as really, really interesting that somehow this woman, way after the war, of course, she lived for a long time, was valued by the families that she wound up working for after she was freed, enough to have her image created. But she was a young girl working as an enslaved woman, probably feeding the militia before this battle, probably attending to whoever got wounded after the battle or whatever, but she was there. So that's just a little sideline. Okay, so now that I've got this all settled for you, I hope, I said, well, okay, where was E6 Hartshorn's house? It's nice for me to put red dots on a map. That doesn't help anybody. And so I did a deed search, and I went backwards and forwards, okay? So I went, I looked, and I said, well, they're the sons who inherit from their father, William, and he inherited from his father, Richard. You already know that. And Richard got the property from the East Jersey proprietors, but he had to also buy it by law from the Lenapes. They were trying to do things a little bit above board anyway. And then I went forward, and I did the deed search, which you can do online now. I used to have to go to Freehold to look through all the old books. Now it's all online, so it's somewhat easier. And I followed what happened all the way down to that year, because by then I had enough information. There's some interesting names on here. I don't know if anybody recognizes that Dutch person. And I don't know if they're related, but I would guess they might be. In any event, here's what happened. You can see that when Robert and his sister Sarah, when they inherited land, they sold some of it to their brother, Isaac, and then he in turn sells it to, back to Robert. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. To another Robert. And then it goes through a series to Tiley Williams, who married into the family, and all the way down, and all these names that I didn't know a whole lot about, but you're going to know about them in a second. So I got a 200-year look at the properties that I'm pretty sure this battle happened at. Yet another map. This is we have these great maps online. They're the coastal surveys. Okay, the precursor to the Coast Guard would go up and down all of our coast after the war and start to create maps about what our coastline looked at. And here's, you can see Sandy Hook, there's the cove, here's Island Beach when it was detached. And when I looked at this map, which was 1836, obviously 50 years or so later, what do I find? But there's a house there, it says house, East Chimney. I'm thinking, that's a funny thing, except it's not. What it is, because these are partly navigation charts too, they're pointing out prominent landmarks so that mariners can see. And so there must have been a house there, and you can see, I hope that this is the Highlands here, right? Because here is Sandy Hook. There must have been a house there with a prominent enough chimney that mariners could see it. So you see where this is going, right? And guess what? A later relative of the Hartshorn sketched, and I don't know how accurate it is, but it's probably pretty close, E6 Hartshorn's house that had been built in 1762, 15 years before this, and look at that chimney. He's up on a hill. So with nothing else around, if you're out in the ocean or even in Sandy Hook Bay, you can probably see that chimney, okay, as a landmark, and so you kind of know where you are on the way to or from New York. So that was really, really interesting. By the way, also on that map is a mention just as Navesink Lighthouse. And in spite of what I said before, there were twin lights there before the current twin lights. Okay, and they look like that. They were two separate towers. Rich White actually did an excavation of one of those a couple summers ago and found the original foundations of the first ones. But another guy on our list of landowners had actually sold that property at the top of the Highlands to the U.S. government for that lighthouse. So these things are starting to come together as I look into it. And then I find this. One of the people on that, on those deeds was a guy named Woodward. And here is, again, you can see the Highlands of Navesink, very prominent. That's Hartshorn's Woods. And right here, along what is now Highlands, those little designations here. It's marshy kinds of lands. It's not what it is today. Okay? And also, on this map, okay, it's hard to see here. Let me see if I can put it. There's the Navesink Twin Lights. And here is a road, which is today Route 36, Navesink Avenue. And look what's there. There's a house there. This is, again, a later map after the battle. I know that in 1795, when Asa Hartshorn dies, the property eventually goes to this guy Woodward, okay, through this chain of events. His daughter, Elizabeth, marries Tylee Williams, and Tylee Williams sells the house in 1809. How about that for a name? Nimrod Woodward. Okay. Who turns the house into a hotel. Because it's now the 19th century, the war's over, and people are starting to see the value of Highlands and Middletown as kind of the vacation spots. You know, it's not what it became yet, but it's beginning to be that way. And so people are coming down from New York by steamboat, and they're vacationing, obviously during the summer mostly. And what happened is, you can see the steamboat, this guy Nimrod Woodward puts a little dock out off this creek so that his guests that he's advertising New York for come down by steamboat, get off that little dock or a dock similar to it in any event, and they walk up to his house and they have their vacation for whatever amount of time. And I think it's that house right there in that little red dot. All of these maps that I'm showing you, it's always in the same place, and there's nothing else around. Okay, 1846 comes along, and this guy, a retired military guy named William Jones, buys the property from Woodward. Okay? This guy, by the way, had been sheriff of New York City, spent his life in the military, and again on this map, what does he do? He has a house right there. He turns that original house that goes way back to 1756, he expands it even further. He calls it the Navesink Hotel. Because by the mid-19th century, there's a lot of tourist activity heating up. And he's connected in New York, so he can get people down here. And over here, you might see, there's a little inlet where his, what he called Woodward's Landing. That's where the steamboats would come, discharge their passengers. They would walk up, 100 yards or so up the hill to this hotel. And that's Snug Harbor today. You know Highlands? Okay. And if you look in the foreground of that picture, that's Honey Park today. Now, see all of this land? That wasn't there during the Battle of 1777. It was marshland. And that land fill happened when they started to dredge out the Shrewsbury River at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. And every time they would dredge the river out, because of steam traffic coming out of Red Bank now to New York, they would take the sand and everything and just fill in. So all of that basically from Bay Avenue and Highlands today, if you know it, to the waterfront, that's all fill. That wasn't there in 1777. But the house that we're talking about is just up the block from where Honey Park is today. So that's where they come with other things. And there, finally we get to a map in 1851, famous map you all know, I think, where it says very proudly, William Jones Navesink House. And you can even see that there's Woodward still living around here. Okay, and there's the lighthouse, and Highlands at this point is starting to become more and more of a tourist destination. There's what remains of Island Beach, and of course Sandy Hook up there. So all of my maps, as I looked at them, yes sir?
My wife is a bird.
She's a what?
Five.
Yes.
Well, the bird, that's her.
So here's our family right next to Clay Pit Creek, is that right? How cool is that? See? Thank you. And you also notice, by the way, on this map, a couple of other names that you might notice. Okay, let me go back a second. Let's go back. So, again, all these maps are lining up. There's the Navesink Hotel. It makes sense where it is to me and everything else. And a couple of years later, 1861, there's a map there. But this one gave me the biggest thing of all. Because what I can see in this map is, instead of just Navesink Avenue here, now there's a little kind of L-shaped road, probably a dirt road that's gone in or is about to go in on this map. And to verify myself, by the way, there's the Neptune's one down there. Okay. Here's Twin Lights up here, what they call the Navesink Hills. And to verify that, there's a name here that a lot of you might know, but there's that little new road that was put in right close to where that house is that we've been talking about. And another sketch I found shows me that that is, if you know this area, Linden Avenue and Waterwitch, right there. So that wasn't there during the battle, but it all lines up. And to check myself, the McGarry house is the oldest house in the Highlands, and that's on this map. Okay, and it's right, I mean, everything just is aligning beautiful. That house is still there, by the way. Okay, that part of Highlands was called Witch Hollow, because allegedly, one of these old guys who used to get drunk at night would come home, literally, and say he was chased by witches. Sounds like a story you tell your wife. I'm late, honey, but it wasn't my fault. I was chased by witches. So Witch Hollow comes into play, right? You'll recognize that in a couple of seconds. Okay, Waterwitch Drive would be on the right here, all the way down the hill, and Linden Avenue is where that cow and that guy is walking there. And that brings us to him. You know James Fenimore Cooper, right? What did James Fenimore Cooper write?
Last of the Mohicans.
Lots of books, Last of the Mohicans, etc., etc. And he was a basically a young lieutenant, whatever they were naming, an ensign in the Navy at one point. And he wrote a book called Waterwitch, Skimmer of the Seas in 1830. And that's one of the covers of the book. It's named after a ship, and allegedly, people have said over the years, you've probably read this in some publications, that he used what was remaining of the Navesink Hotel way back when the Eastern Hartshorn House as an inspiration for what he called lust and rust. Don't get excited, don't get excited. Lust and rust is Dutch for pleasure and rest. And so what happens is people, when this book comes out, start to think, wow, this is great promo here. There's a guy with Waterwitch. If we do a little maneuvering here, Witch Hollow, we can easily call that Waterwitch. I'm talking about the Stampton Town fathers of Highlands who capitalized on this. And so the legend begins that he saw the remains of that house, he incorporated it into the book, and there's absolutely no proof that he was anywhere near that. And part of the coincidence is that because people thought he used Woodward's and obviously Hartshorn's house as a model, was because he lived in Highlands, but not this Highlands. He lived up next to Cooperstown, which was his family. You know where the Hall of Fame is? That's his father's. Town was named after his father. So it made perfect sense if you want to attract people to Highlands in those days, publicity machines being whatever they are, to say, oh, obviously he wrote this book and he was inspired by this old house here on the hill. And so what do? They take names from the book and they incorporate that into street names in the Highlands. That's pretty clever. You know, who's going to tell them not? Okay, now we'll get to someplace. 1870, or actually in this case 66, Highlands is now ripe for development. And so a lot of the land is starting to get filled in by the dredge spoils, all of this. Here's what they now call Jones Creek. Okay, that was coming in. All of these land offerings are being put up for sale. And what do I see? Right there by Linden and Waterwitch Avenue, this information says boarding house. And I go, there it is. That is the same location it's always been. That boarding house in this year, 1866, was what was left of Woodward and Jones's hotel on this map. And it had a particular resonance to me, and I'll tell you why. If I could get my button. Linden and Waterwitch goes all the way down. And again, remember, at the time of the battle, this property here was marshland, so it wasn't filled in like it is now. And for another time, right down at the bottom of that hill, a couple years later, is where Joshua Huddy gets hanged. The British did that on purpose. I just finished up a book that I'm writing on Huddy. And they did that as a reminder to Joshua Huddy that they had beat him militia at the Issa Hartshorn's house 5 years earlier. They had him captured. He was in a ship on Sandy Hook. They could have hanged him in Sandy Hook, but they didn't. Richard Lippincott brings him across the river and hangs him there. And I know that's a dirty reminder of, look what happens. We beat you all the time. Story for another time. Okay, but see right there where that black star is? The reason that all this was interesting to me, and the reason I go on and on about it, was because I grew up there in the summers. I was lucky enough that my parents rented out a bungalow at a place called Gravelly Point. That whole area was called Gravelly Point originally, but by the time we got there in the 50s, our road was called Gravelly Point Road. How dare you laugh? That's the best fish I ever caught. That's a picture of me in what year? 57 apparently. I was 12, and there I am at Gravelly Point, and I imagine my mother or father took that picture. I was so proud of catching my fluke there. And in those years, I had no idea how historic this whole area was. And that Gravelly Point area was also where the British, after they left the Battle of Navesink in 1780, where they went across the river to Sandy Hook, there and also down by the bar system. So all of this history is fueled by this incredibly interesting area. Okay, now we get into what I think is the proof of all this. So the Monmouth Democrat runs an article in 1875 that the Waterridge home, that house we've been talking about, burned down. And all that was left was that. And guess what that is, of course? It's a couple of floors. You can see there would have been a floor there. The second floor would have had that chimney, this prominent chimney. And so that also fed the legend that, you know, Waterridge, the book, Lusted Rust had to be this fabulous hotel in the book that he must have patterned after this place. And the other chimney that had been up there for years that nobody on the other side of the house that nobody bothered with was actually taken apart and put together by Dr. Everett Fields, it says here. And that chimney is gone now because they took it from the old bricks. But those andirons are still in the possession of the Highlands Historic Society. And I think there's a good chance they go all the way back to the original Issa Hartshorn's house. So that stuff still exists. And just to bring you back to the picture of the house as it eventuated, there are the chimneys that would have lined up that the mariners used for mummers all those years before. Okay, so where is it today? So here is Route 36, as I hope you know. I know Ray knows Caboosian Field. I used to play ball there as a kid too. Caboosian Field was put in much later in the 19th century, 20th century actually. Okay, and where that boarding house and all the other places, the remains of Issa Hartshorn's house was right there between Rogers and Wardell Avenue. Here is Linden, here's Waterridge. All of this lines up. That's what I think the British did on that day. They had two flanking lines, and you can see how when there's nothing else there but this house, it was surprising for those men coming through the woods. And this is where I got excited and called up Rich White. I said, oh man, we should investigate this. And he said, yeah, but what's there now? And that's a problem. Okay? By the way, Caboosian Field goes up in the 40s. Okay? That family, very famous in town. There is that location today between, you can see Rogers Street and Wardell Avenue. Okay, and there's Caboosian Field down below. And so I went there and I took pictures of that location there. And the problem is that there's this, as it used to be always before they put roads in, there's this hill that, I don't know if it belongs to the town or whoever it belongs to, but had they come up that way, which they surely did, you know, how are you going to excavate that? Because obviously there's nothing to see anymore. Worse yet, where that house is a condominium. And it's all private property. So, you know, you'd have to go through hoops, even if you were, and Rich White is, a very skilled archaeologist to be able to excavate that property. And, you know, very few private property owners are going to let you do that. And besides, it had to be plowed like Caboosian Field was. Caboosian Field was dug out of what are, you know, Monmouth Hills now. They leveled it, was at Hillside. So anything that might have been left over from the battle, musket balls or anything else that might have been left, are probably long gone, and Rich said that it was worth doing any kind of major excavation. And so there's no trace of this anymore. In fact, I probably, if I had enough courage, I'd knock on those people's doors and say, you know what happened here in 1777? Unless are they sitting here tonight by any chance? So then they probably don't know any more than I did. And I'll tell you why I didn't know. When I was in the Highlands, here's another image, by the way, there's Hunting Park down there. I would come from Gravelly Point and walk up, what is now South Linden, on the way to OLSTH, I think it's Metro Church on Sundays, right by these places. I had no idea. There's no marker there, although we're working on that. The Highlands group and the DAR is working on putting a marker, probably somewhere in this vicinity over here, right there probably, so that people can see it and understand what was on in 1777. So here's my question to you. Most of us, including me, said we didn't recognize the name, had no knowledge of it, never came across it. Why is not this battle remembered? Or why hasn't it? What's your guess?
Because we lost.
That's a real good reason. You don't usually celebrate losses. But what else?
There were hundreds of these little skirmishes all over New Jersey, and hundreds.
New Jersey has been called the crossroads of the Revolution. More battles were fought here during the Revolution than anywhere else in the country. And if you don't believe me, wait a year. You're going to have a celebration in every town in Monmouth County and the whole state celebrating our 250th. There were at least 746 skirmishes, including battles like the Battle of Monmouth, all over the state. It was incredible what went on here. So this one gets lost in the shuffle.
In 1777, they had something called forage wars.
So what's going on, what he's referring to, is both sides, rebels and also the British, because by now the British they've taken over Manhattan, or New York, basically, and they're letting the loyalists, mostly, except for instance like this, do all of the dirty work. And everybody's breaking everybody else's farm for supplies, foraging. They're taking cattle, they're taking food, they're taking vegetables, fruit, whatever. Both sides are doing this. And a lot of people in Monmouth County, and Middletown especially, are selling their produce to the British at Sandy Hook. People called refugees, who are loyalists that had to leave their homes. There's so much pressure on them that they were living in refugee town at the base of the Sandy Hook Lighthouse. So again, there's a lot of things going on here. If you're part of one side or another, you might not want to publicize that your ancestor was captured and put in the sugar house. But another big reason was that the British miscalculated. They thought on the basis of this, they were going to put down this little rebellion that's maybe a year and a half old now, really quickly. Look how easy we can take care of these rebels. They had no idea what was coming. Nor did we. When I say we, the descendants of the Continental Army folks. Washington's not at his peak yet in 1777. You know that it was nip and tuck, and there were times where he despaired, especially that he was never going to put together a fighting force. In fact, in 1778, a year and a half later, basically, he didn't win the Battle of Monmouth. It was a draw. But because he stood up to the British in surprising ways as they were retreating from Philadelphia over to Sandy Hook and then New York, it gave everybody, loyalists, I should say, rebels, certainly the Army, enough confidence to think, hey, we can fight these guys. And it begins to change the course of the war. That's a year after this. I also think, by the way, and it's not documented, there's a pretty good chance that two very good prominent characters in our history are at that 1777 battle. There's a good chance that Colonel Tye, who was the escaped slave who wound up fighting for the British, there's a good chance, because nobody knows where he is for a couple of years, that he may be at Sandy Hook helping out the refugees. And we know that some refugee guides led the British up Hartshorn Woods. And he was raised as an enslaved man at the tip point of Rumson before he escaped. So he might have been there. And also, Joshua Honey gets up here in 1776 from Salem County, where he's from. And we know that he's in the militia eventually under David Foreman. And he might have been here too. Maybe he's one of the guys that ran away. There's no documentation that says that anywhere I can find. But it's intriguing anyway. And if he wasn't, there were plenty of other people that were at this battle on the rebel side that subsequently had big parts to play in the Revolutionary War. So again, there's a lot of reasons this thing was kind of overlooked. Anybody go to school in the Highlands or Middletown? Did you ever hear about it then?
No. No.
Right, Ray?
No.
Never mentioned?
Nope.
And I don't think it was left out on purpose. I think just people forgot it wasn't all that glorious. And, you know, as the gentleman said, you know, you lose and nobody wants to celebrate that. But we should, and we will. And the DAR is going to do a good job with some plaques celebrating a lot of these people. Because no matter what, they fought for what they believed in, as both sides did. And these patriots went on to help found where we are today. Founded the country. Obviously, this is part of our geography, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's it. If we could hit the lights there, Laura, that'd be great. Questions, comments, suggestions, objections? Ray?
Rick, up in Monmouth Hills, there's now the water which
Closed.
now used for a wedding venue and that sort of thing. Did any of the action take place that far up?
I don't think so. Although, my guess is that when the guys are running from the house, they're probably going up that way, trying to get over the other side to wherever they can. But nothing that would identify that.
And is there any indication as to overall which way they escaped? Did they head towards, you know,
So the way this played out, I'm thinking they're running in all directions into the woods.
Okay.
And some of them are wounded and, you know, they died and get buried by locals. You know, that kind of minutia is never recorded.
Right.
I'm sure that some very, very prominent family members were part of those people that escaped that destruction. And either their family lost track of the story, or maybe it just never got publicized. I always believe that in the attics of places like Middletown, older families have documents that are really important. I know my friend Peter here has got a lot of old documents from early Middletown history that are enlightening to give us little insights into what went on. But, you know, think about it. If you run away from a battle like this, I don't think you're going around town going, hey, guess what I did? I escaped. I mean, your family would know if you're lucky enough to escape, but you're not going to brag about that, I don't think. But who knows? Other questions? Yes, sir?
Earlier you mentioned Scudder was
Yeah,
in the militia, right?
yes,
Now, is he related to the Scudder property in Navesink?
probably. I don't know for that. Nathaniel Scudder, by the way, very prominent guy. He's the guy that writes the letter to, of all people, George Washington about honeybeeing. And in 1780, Scudder gets killed in Rumson at Black Point in another battle. So all of these areas, and as I mentioned, I grew up around these areas and had no idea how rich in our history we are, especially in Revolutionary Wars. So I should tell you too that pretty much it's established that what's going on in Monmouth County, particularly during the Revolutionary War, is really a civil war. There's families fighting each other. There's farmer neighbors fighting each other. Okay, civilians. And there are people that know he's a loyalist and he's a rebel. And you know, there's all kinds of things going on at night, people raiding each other, and burning houses and barns, all kinds of things. So it's not like a battlefront where on that side it's the enemy, on this side it's us. It's everywhere. And it's really, really confusing. But out of that confusion, we get a lot of really great stories and legacy of people and families. Just go on and on and on. I venture to say that Middletown has got more Revolutionary War history than probably any place else in Monmouth County, with the exception of maybe Freehold. Because look where it is. Remember, Navesink was then part of Middletown. So obviously they want to, and people like the Taylors who lived up in Chapel Hill, they want to be able to see what's going on. And so not the prominent families, but anybody else would be aware all the time of things happening in the vicinity. It's just a crucial part of the geography. Other folks?
Nicely done, Rick.